Elias pushed himself tighter against the alley wall, feeling the broken brick wetness cooling his cheek and soaking into his torn suit jacket. His left hand crept up to his heart, which beat so loud in his ears he could barely hear the din of the bar around the corner, much less the sounds he was actually straining to hear. Horses' hooves, the whip of wind through a long jacket. Possibly, there was nothing to be worried about. Possibly, he'd just seen the movement of a curtain, heard the inconstant prancing of a wounded horse. Possibly, he'd had too many drinks waiting for the blasted ship to finally arrive in port, and he was just sprinting around the wharf for no reason, scaring whores with his frenzied, darting eyes and making men suspicious, making an ass of himself. Then he heard it. The noise. The worst one he could hear. The whistling. The goddamn whistling. The hoofs came next, a horse at a saunter, moving down the shining midnight cobbles toward the alley he'd ducked into. Its steps were only slightly offbeat, the hoof with the broken ankle stamping just out of time. He dared a glance out into the alley and their eyes met, him and the rider, and he broke into a run. Elias bolted across the street, risking exposure to avoid getting caught against the cliffs behind him. The wounded horse whinnied, and he felt something pass behind him to skitter down the street. He rounded the corner at the back of the buildings and tripped into a half-rotted wooden railing and went through the thing. For a moment he was falling, and then he was rolling over blunt hunks of rock and grass, not knowing whether he should try to stop himself. He finally came to rest in a trickling gutter, surprising himself with how quickly he managed to jump to his feet and continue on, not daring a look back and screaming when he heard another whistle, and then the loud thunk of something burying itself in a wooden door beside his head. If he paused at all, it was only long enough to touch the heavy red envelope in his jacket pocket. The next alley led him into a deep crowd of drunken Catholics, singing and raising fat glasses of beer over their heads. Only a handful seemed to notice him or even seemed shocked or concerned about how shabby he was. They merely stepped out of his way and continued talking and singing their inane songs. When he looked back over his shoulder, he could see the rider, the shape of him, at least, sitting tall atop his horse in the alley. "God damn it," Elias whispered under his breath, watching the figure stride out of sight. He tried to keep track of where the thing was going, but he couldn't make heads or tails of the shadows through the carousing mass. These were the German sort of Catholics, obnoxiously tall people, many of them done up in costumes and even wearing absurd headpieces. He pushed his way through them, trying to find a good middle ground between the edge of the crowd and the alleys the rider had disappeared into. His only option was to get to the pier. That was evident enough. They'd learned the thing had enough troubles with rivers and lakes that the ocean herself should prove more than enough to get it off Elias's trail for good. That had been the plan when he got here. That and making the handoff at the mermaid right after her arrival. But the goddamned mermaid hadn't arrived, and the rider had caught up with him. Now he could either count the money as lost and run, or stay and die. Kellen had gotten greedy and stayed back in Utah, and look how that had turned out. Elias found himself short of breath and stumbled. Somebody had spilled something warm on him, one of those goddamn Germans. He touched the wet spot on his back and returned a hand and forearm shining red with blood. That's not right, he thought to himself. Curious German faces looked down at him. One of them asked if he was okay, and he slapped at the man, a gesture so weak it was interpreted as asking for help to his feet. A crowd had gathered around Elias, and they were now speaking in rough and worried voices to each other. They started carrying him in the direction of the buildings he'd run from, toward the rider. "No!" he yelled, twisting wildly. Something gave in his back, and he screamed all the louder. The Germans began screaming too, clearly trying to get him to stop moving. None of them seemed to see the rider there in the shadows between the buildings, the eyeless flap of skin over its face catching an errant breeze as it adjusted itself on its saddle. Elias realized he was looking at Kellen's face. Get the fuck off me! He screamed, finally fumbling his way out of the German's hands. They shouted amongst each other and pointed at him, pleaded with him to calm down. He pulled out his pistol and fired into the air. The report was pathetic, a little crack, but it made the Germans duck down and back away from him. He tried to holster the thing but dropped it. The Germans screamed, expecting it to go off, but it merely lay there in the quickening rain. He bent and scraped it off the ground, stumbling and dropping to his knees as he did so. Get the fuck away from me, he said, looking through the crowd to the thing watching him from atop its horse. He pushed himself to his feet, leaving a scarlet cloud in the water on the pavement. Then he holstered the gun, rose, and limped away.